key piece, I think, that probably should be addressed at every decision point for therapy is whether or not the patient's eligible for a clinical trial. We cannot understate this, and we cannot underestimate the benefit. So a patient like this who's young, who has good performance status, and has a disease that has already demonstrated that it's not responding like we would anticipate, and she's already gone through a couple different lines of chemotherapy, she's a very good candidate for a consideration clinical trial. Fortunately, we have a number of clinical trials that she would be eligible for. But I want to highlight that it's absolutely critical that at every treatment decision point that a clinical trial option be at least addressed. There are many places around the country where patients can now participate in clinical trials, and it's ultimately the only thing that's going to move the needle on expectations for outcomes for not only the patient herself, but also future patients. I mentioned that clinical trials was a good option and a consideration for this patient, and I think that there are a number of very interesting compounds under development. Fortunately, we have a number of clinical trials that a patient could participate in. And I would say that those trials have centered around three specific kind of areas that we've already mentioned. So PARP, angiogenesis, and immunotherapy. So the immuno-oncology agents that we've seen in this setting have had kind of limited outcomes as single agents. And so there's a lot of work being done to try to figure out ways to make this particular disease more immunoreactive, and that's involving a number of different combinations. So there's a number of combinations that are under investigation, trying to amplify or accentuate the relatively modest response rates we're seeing with single agent immune checkpoint inhibitors. Another thing I would mention in the immuno-oncology angle part of this is that these combinations of these three drugs, as I mentioned, PARP, angiogenesis, immuno-oncology, is that they're being used together. So they're being used together as doublets, and they're being used together in triplets, trying to figure out whether or not that's a way to actually accentuate the response rates of each of those individual components. Now there's another class of drug out there that's under pretty mature development. We call it the antibody or antigen drug conjugates. And there's one that's being evaluated in the FORWARD-1 trial, which is an antibody drug conjugate that targets folate receptor alpha, mirvetuximab. This particular drug actually works kind of like as a stealth bomb. It has attached to the antibody, it has a chemical or chemo warhead. So the idea is that with expression of folate on the surface of the cancer cell as opposed to the non-cancer cell, this would attach, be taken into the cell, cleave the linker to the chemotherapy, and release the chemotherapy. So it's kind of a nice model for delivering chemotherapy agents. And this trial is ongoing, and it's randomizing this novel compound to physician's choice chemo, kind of similar, as I mentioned, in some of the other clinical trial designs. Ovarian cancer is we're learning is a very complicated disease, and it's probably not one disease. Today we focused on a patient who presented in a typical way but had an atypical recurrence pattern. And there's a number of obviously different ways that a patient could present and have her natural history, and they're good fodder for future kind of discussions. But I think the case illustrates some very important factors that should be common no matter what happens. So I mentioned, family history and the disconnect between that and germline. So a young patient should automatically alert that there's something potentially going on and how to take that kind of family history. The second is that she has an epithelial ovarian cancer, and that should be an automatic for germline testing. And we didn't have that information, and if we didn't have that information at the time that the patient was seen, we would have been able to get that information. And we talked about the complexity of choosing surgery, when to do it, and in the context of what's the optimal chemotherapy. And all of that is still kind of being worked out, but I think we're starting to center on a kind of a standard approach that's incorporating novel therapy and chemotherapy together, or biological therapy with chemotherapy together. And there's a number of clinical trials in that space that are being done to investigate what's the optimal frontline treatment. And an area we didn't really talk about, but is also becoming more of interest, is what we talk is the term maintenance. So in a patient like this, that we in our case history, we didn't get a chance to really delve into the maintenance issue, but there's a lot of investigative work being done there as an effort to kind of prolong or ultimately reach that goal, as I mentioned, of cure. Fortunately, in the recurrent setting, we have a lot of options, and that work needs to be continued because, as we know, unfortunately, most patients who develop recurrent disease ultimately die from that disease or the complications from that. So it's very important for us to continue relentlessly to expand what our options are in that space so that we can ultimately achieve that elusive goal of cure for those patients.